Uh, Thank you. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you weren't here, we prayed for you, and hopefully you're picking the lesson up. Otherwise, thank you. We have ladies in-house and ladies on Zoom, and we are very well aware that the enemy is battling to keep all of God's word away. So we want to really pay attention to what he has to say, and we will figure out what is what's speaking to us at the end of these chapters. And then in chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him, and he said to him, there were two men in one city, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had exceedingly many flocks and herds. The poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he had brought and nourished. And it grew up together with him and his children. It ate of his own food and drank from his own cup and lay in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. In verse 4, a traveler came to the rich man who refused to take from his own flock and from his own herd to prepare one for the wayfaring man who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. So David hadn't listened to the conviction of the Holy Spirit, right? We know that David was still doing his own thing. And so now God's going to send someone else to speak to David. Even when David wasn't listening, God was still faithful, right?
Mm-hmm.
David,
really
when
good
we're
point.
not faithful,
Yeah.
God's still faithful. And sometimes he really has to knock us around to get our attention. But yeah, David wasn't listening to the Holy Spirit. God had sent enough signals, warnings all through Bathsheba, he had told him. He just had his ears turned off. And so, God cocks you, but not forever. God won't try to get your attention forever. There'll come a point when he'll just say, okay, you don't want to listen?
That'd be awful.
Yeah.
That'd be awful.
But if we remain unrepentant, he's not gonna continue to speak to you forever. So listen while the listening's good, as they say. But Nathan is coming to David, and he's using this story to get the message across to David.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, David was a shepherd, right? And he understands lambs, sheep, so he's using what's familiar to David to get his attention. And he's going to describe to David, and remember, David was the ultimate judge in Israel, right? When you had something that the elders or whatever of the tribes couldn't figure out, you had an audience with the king if you needed it. So David, being the ultimate judge, had to make a lot of decisions for the people of Israel. And Nathan is bringing forward the sin of theft, because David did steal something that wasn't his.
Yeah.
And even though it was Bathsheba, it belonged to Uriah. She belonged to Uriah. And so he's really bringing out the sin of theft, and his sexual sin. But in his sexual sin, he took what wasn't his. And it should have been a sentence of death. Adultery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both parties would be stoned. That would be the king and Bathsheba both were guilty. But it would have fallen on David's head because he was the aggressor. But
Yeah, I think it would have been hard for her to deny him. I mean, he was the king.
yeah,
We couldn't have.
but in those days,
I don't
it
think
was
so.
both parties, and it would have been death. They were both, in adultery as they saw it.
You think of that king's wife that refused to prance around in front of him.
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah,
always
he
think of
banished her.
her,
Mhm.
that she refused,
Yeah.
so Bathsheba could have.
Yeah, we
refused.
don't read any, that, we have to read between the lines, but yeah, we don't see that. I think God just leaves that because there's so many situations where, you can or can't make a fuss, in those situations, and either one. But David's anger was greatly aroused against the man, and he tells Nathan in verse 5, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die, and he shall restore fourfold to for the lamb, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And so David assumes this story is true that Nathan's telling him, and so he's gonna pass judgment on it, right? Even though Nathan didn't ask him for judgment, did he?
No.
No, he didn't ask him, but he's gonna pass judgment on this story anyway. He's so incensed, King David is, and he passes a sentence of death. Even though it's not a capital crime, this is theft, he passes a sentence of death. And, you know, the thing is, from God is David had to condemn his own sin for himself. David had to be able to see how bad his own sin was in himself in order for God to be able to heal it and in order for him to repent from it. And so, yes, David had the sin of theft. He also had the sin of adultery. And David, by giving this man who wasn't real, but gave him a sentence of death, he's saying in what his sin should have been in and of itself. God works in mysterious ways. And same thing with us. We've got to recognize that we're sinners and need a savior, and then we've got to condemn the sin in our lives. And with us, we are to die to self, right? It's a death sentence. We our sin, and we die to self in order to follow the Lord. But it's interesting, David also knew from the law that something had to be restored, not only repentance, but restoration, right? And so he had to make it right. And so David understands that the man should have had pity on his neighbor and that he didn't. But then again, neither did David. David had absolutely no pity on Uriah whatsoever. And all of this encompasses everything that David did and has been holding in. And then in verse 7, Nathan tells David, "You are the man." Oh, can you imagine? I mean, I'm just thinking, whoa, you're hiding a sin you think nobody knows, and you're the king and you're all that, and then, that finger comes and it's right at you. You did it. This is, oh man, I could just imagine. I don't want to know. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I appointed you king over Israel. I delivered you from the hand of Saul. Verse 8, I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your keeping. I gave you the house of Israel. I gave you Judah. And if that had been too little, I also would have given you much more. Why have you despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? You have killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife. You have killed him with the sword of the people of Ammon. And so Nathan applies this parable now to David. He's shocking him into seeing his sin. And he's shocking him into seeing the gravity of how bad his sin is. I made a note to the side for us that a personal salvation requires a personal conviction of sin. A personal salvation requires, and that's why salvation is individual, because it requires that a man or a woman are convicted of their sin, that they realize the gravity of their sin and it's sending them to hell, and that they need a way out, a savior. And that's how a person becomes saved, by realizing that. But God gave David everything. And it's interesting, in verse 8, he would have given him more.
Yeah.
He would have given him more, but David, with this ingratitude, chose to sin instead. He had to have what he had to have when he had to have it, and even though God had given him everything, it wasn't enough. It was like saying, God, I know you gave me everything, but it's not enough. I want this. And he went for it. Wow. Therefore, he just despised the commandment of the Lord.
He's gonna get it all right.
Paid dearly for it.
Yeah, he despised the commandment of the Lord as if it was wrong, right? And then verse 10, now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. You notice the Lord knows everything, right?
Yeah.
The Lord let David know. He wasn't hiding nothing about nothing. I mean, he knew the names, he knew the wins and the wheres and everything that happened. Same with us. You can hide it from the person next to you, but you can't hide it from the Lord. He knows all about that. And now he's getting the judgment. This is therefore. The therefore is now that you're gonna be disciplined. This is the judgment. There's always consequences to what you do. And so he's now gonna know violence and bloodshed in his family. David asked 4 times in verse 6, 4 times restitution. And it's interesting because David had said that in his judgment. Now God's gonna exact a 4-time restitution from David. And he's gonna take it from four of David's sons, 4 times. It's gonna happen to David. David said he needs to restore that man 4-fold. God said, you said the judgment, okay? 4-fold to you, David. 4 of your sons are going to. It's Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah, and then Bathsheba's son, the little baby. There's 4 of them. God despised, or David despised God's commandment, and God said, you despise my commandment, you despise me. Whoa, that hit home. If I despise a commandment, and if I'm not obeying a commandment of the Lord, God says you're despising it, and if you despise that, you despise me. Ooh, Lord, I don't want to be in that place where I despise you, Lord, for anything. And then it was just like, Lord, show me, if I'm, doing something that I think is cool and it's not, And then in verse 11 and 12, the Lord is telling him, I'm going to raise up adversity against you from your own house. Take your wives before your eyes, give them to your neighbor. He's going to lie with your wives in the sight of this son. For you did it secretly. And this is a good verse to underline, verse 12. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, before the sun. Things that you do in secret, if you don't listen to the Holy Spirit, if you don't repent, if you don't listen to the Holy Spirit, God will deal with them openly. Doug and I were talking about that in his life too, and it's like the things that he was doing, at the end of the day, got dealt with very openly. And we don't like that. So don't allow God to work. But adversity, it says, behold, I am raising up adversity. That word means rebellion. Because David brought rebellion and trouble to another man's house, God's going to allow trouble into David's house. Another person is going to violate his wives like he violated Uriah's wife. God's pretty fair. So, verse 13, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. Isn't it amazing how fast? Lord had already forgiven as they're talking, as David's heart was repentive. As soon as he said, Lord, I've sinned against you, and God can see your heart, what's going on in there and where it's at. Immediately, even before they finished speaking, he said, the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die, meaning death was on the table. Death was on the table. Adultery, like I said, death for both parties. Death was on the table for the king if he hadn't repented.
Adultery and murder, right?
And murder, yeah, and murder, yeah. Murder, take a life, your life will be taken, right? And so David accepts blame for his sin, finally. And he says, Hata al Yahweh, means I have sinned against the Lord. It's just a beautiful thing. Hata al Yahweh in Hebrew, and it's very dramatic, but something that's kind of cool to say every day, because I said, Lord, that's every day I sin against you. But it's Hata, H-A-T-A, and then A-L-Yahweh, Y-A-H-W-E-Y, which means I have sinned against the Lord. And it's just, it just sounds beautiful in Hebrew. And that was from David's heart. And also you want to make a note to the side and you can look at it later. That's when he wrote Psalms 51.
Yeah.
And then, the fact that the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. However, verse 14, because by this deed you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. The child also who was born to you shall surely die. So God's forgiveness was immediate. David would be spared the death penalty for the adultery. David had done, however, what the enemies of God would do, sinned and hid the sin. That's what God's enemies do. And God's saying, you've given my enemies occasion to blaspheme me. That's what we do when we sin. When other people know that we've sinned, or other people see that we're doing something that God doesn't approve of and we haven't repented, it gives God's enemies a chance to say, yeah, Christianity, that's no big deal, or that God must not be that important because fill in the blank. But he's going to have consequences, right? When we sin, you're forgiven immediately, but there's the consequences of the sin. And first thing is Bathsheba's son, hers and his son is going to die. And yeah. But Nathan goes to his house, and then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David. I want you to notice the difference when God says Uriah's wife, to the point where God finally says your wife, David. There's a place where that happens. But here it says the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David. It became ill. This was a child that came out of all of the disobedience, out of all the sin and everything. And how could God bless that child? How could that child be raised in that house all the time? Because it was a product of everything wrong in God's life. God gave it, God took it home. It's with the Lord. But David is pleading, at that time, David pleads with God for the child. He's fasting, laying on the ground, and the elders of the house arose, went to him to raise him up from the ground. They wanted him to eat. And again, all through the Bible, God uses 3s and 7s a lot, right? 3s, obviously, because of 3 days and 7 days day completion. But on the 7th day, it came to pass that the child died. And his servants come and tell him the child was dead. They said, indeed, while the child was alive, we spoke to him, and he would not heed, speaking of David, our voice. How can we tell him that the child is dead? I mean, they were afraid. David David could do anything. He's king. When David saw that his servants were whispering, he kind of gets the idea that the child is dead. And so he says to his servants, is he? And they said, he is. And in 20, David gets up off the ground, washes and anoints himself, changes his clothes. And what does he do?
He goes into worship.
He goes into the house of the Lord and he worshiped. Then he went to his own house. And when he requested, they set food. Now he's going to eat. And they don't get it. But see, here's what we talk about a lot. Here's the world watching you, right? What do you do in these circumstances? When the child was alive, he's praying and he's fasting and he's calling on the Lord. As soon as he understands that the Lord has taken the child home, he goes to the house of the Lord. And they say, why? What did you do? And he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, verse 22, for I said, who can tell? The Lord might be gracious to me and the child may live. But now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? Instead, I'm going to go to him, but he shall not return to me. So, since the sickness of the child came immediately after Nathan's words, David is receiving it as from the hand of God, because it came right after Nathan said, you know, this is what's going to happen. And again, David being married to Bathsheba, but the child was conceived while Uriah was alive. Therefore, it was considered Uriah's child, even though, you know, it came, but her husband was alive when she became pregnant. And so in God's eyes, at that time, she was still Uriah's wife.
That's
And
what David was hoping people would believe.
yeah,
And it didn't work.
yeah. But I mean, he's crying out for mercy.
Yeah.
He does not change God's mind. God's mind on this particular thing had been formed, and sometimes even extraordinary prayer and fasting does not change God's mind, but it put David in the right place to receive what he needed from God. Once David, you know, his prayer and his fasting, and he really prayed and he really fasted, it didn't change God's plan as to what was going to happen, but it did put David in the place where David needed to be. And prayer is not a tool to get our desire from God, but demonstrations of radical submission and surrender to God's power and plans and his will. So David's prayers were answered in that he had a sense of peace when the child died. He could eat, he could go out, he could do, you know, he knew where the child was, and there was that sense of peace now. And he, knowing he did all he could to seek God's mercy, that gave him, you know, I prayed, I did what I could do. This is what God did. I bow down to God's plan, his sovereignty, and his power. And that put David right where he needed to be.
Could you repeat that prayer, something, 3 or 4 things you said right after that?
That
I was gonna try and write that down, but I
No,
missed it.
knowing that he did all that he could do. Oh, the prayer the note that I made about prayer. Oh, yeah, prayer is not a tool to get our desire from God, but demonstrates, or it's a demonstration of, I should say, radical submission and surrender to God's power and his will.
Okay, I could write that down afterwards, I guess.
Yeah. In other words, you know, we need to realize it's his way, his plan, his power, his will. We need to be submissive to it and surrender to it and understand, you know, we'll never understand exactly because we're not God. We have these human minds, but we will when we see him face to face. He'll explain it to you. We need the ability to worship and honor God in a time of trial or crisis with spiritual confidence. And that's a good one to write down, spiritual confidence, spiritual confidence. Do you have spiritual confidence? When something as dramatic as this happens, to be able to pray and have spiritual confidence. And then David was confident in what? That he would meet his son again. That was where David's confidence was, and his hope and everything, so he could just go on. And that's what we have. We have that same hope and should have that same confidence, no matter what. That we will be, they will be there, we will be there, and it's what motivates us. In verse 24, then David comforted Bathsheba, his wife. Okay? You see that he made God made the transition in Bible that to call her his wife then, at that time, now. After the sin was repented from, after the sin was dealt with, after the judgment was passed out, now she is his wife. And now he's able to go in and she bears him a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him. I like that.
I think it's so amazing though that the first child that Bathsheba had was killed, but Solomon, the second one, God loved him a lot, gave him wisdom and
Yeah, and he sent word by the hand of Nathan the prophet, so he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. So Solomon's born to David and Bathsheba again.
So is Solomon's name Jedediah?
Uh-huh,
Two names.
he has two names,
Like Billy. Billy Jack.
yeah. So now they are to honor God in their marriage. And we see great love, we see great forgiveness from the Lord. Because what had to be dealt with was dealt with God's way. Now there's a blessing. Now there's a blessing. Wow, and what a blessing it is. Now Solomon is born, and God, even God himself, gives that child a name. Jedediah means loved of the Lord. Loved of the Lord. God says, I'm going to name him loved by me, and also his name Solomon. That's just, oh man, it just gives you chicken skin, really. And in 26, Joab fought against Rabbah of the people of Ammon and took the royal city. Joab sent messengers to David and said, I fought against Rabbah, I've taken the city, I've taken the water supply. Therefore get all the rest of the people together and encamp against this city and take it. David, lest I take the city, Joab speaking, and it be called after my name. Yeah, that's pretty bold to speak, but he did. So the war continues against these Ammonites here, and Joab wants David to get up and get going and get doing what he's supposed to be doing as king, and that's going to battle. So Joab struggled for a little over a year to conquer this city, Rabbah. But victory only came after David got things right with God, with what was going on in his life, because he's king. Once that all got right, they're going to go have victory. Then it was interesting that David's sin at home is hindering Joab's and the rest of Israel's victory out in the field. Isn't that something? David's sin at home, our sin, maybe my sin at home would be hindering my victory for my family, maybe my family's victory, until it's dealt with. That, not always necessarily, but it's always worth paying attention to. And then in 29, David's gathering all his people, and they go to Rabbah and they fight, and he took their king's crown from his head. Its weight was a talent of gold with precious stones. I understand it was really big and really beautiful. So he goes back to doing what he should have been doing all along. He's in battle. He has victory, and he had and he's going to have still consequences for his sin, but there's still a crown on David's head, right? God, the faithfulness of God, the mercy, the grace, the long suffering of God, as you see what David went through, and yet no different than us in our lives and what we're going through and what we're doing and how patient and long suffering God is. Chapter 13, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. So we're talking about, you remember he had 6 wives, right? So we're talking about half brothers and half sisters against the law, the law. Amnon being David's firstborn. He was from Ahinoam, I think her name was. Yeah. But this guy Amnon, he's first in line for the throne too. He's number 1. He's first in line for the throne. Absalom and his sister Tamar, they were the kids born from Maacah, I think her name was Maacah. Her father was Talmai, kind of descended from Anak, that big giant dude, Anak. And Tamar is available to marry. That's what it says when it talks about Tamar. She's available to marry. And,
She's a virgin.
She's a virgin. What that means is she's available to marry. But not to Amnon. That was forbidden. That was forbidden. And so Amnon has a friend, some friend named Jonadab. Yeah. And it says he's crafty. I like that word crafty. Crafty. You don't want to be crafty. He's crafty, and he's gonna give his friend some advice. He's actually wicked, and he's gonna give wicked advice, and he's gonna start this chain of events. Always pay attention to who your friends are. That is a biggie right there. Who are your friends whispering in your ear? This guy happens to be his cousin, and Amnon, he's lusting after Tamar. He is not in love with her. We find that out down the road, but he's spoiled brat. Unfortunately, King David spoiled his children. It was a big, huge castle. They lived in different parts of it. It's not like they saw each other all the time every day. King's busy doing king stuff, and the raising of the children was not one of David's strong points. But he's lusting after her. He doesn't even call her. He doesn't even acknowledge her as his half sister. If you notice in the text, he calls her Absalom's sister. Takes away the thing of but she's my half sister. So he kind of puts her like over there. But Jonadab is going to devise this really wicked plan, and Amnon likes it. And in verse 6, it's interesting that David doesn't suspect anything. I thought, boy, this dude is really not paying attention right now. He just really isn't suspecting anything. Oh, Dad, could you have Tamar come in? And he had servants. Why would he want her to specifically come in and do that? And I mean, she was really pretty, and everybody could see that. But yeah, David doesn't suspect anything. I mean, he's really indulgent. So this is the guy that's ready to take over the throne. Whatever you want, sweetie. What do you want? You want your sister to come in and fix something for you? Sure, no problem. So this actually becomes a command. It becomes a command from the king that she go. Kind of takes all the burden off of Amnon, he's thinking, and puts a little bit of it on David, right? Yeah, in the way he's thinking. David, you commanded that she come in, so it was not all my fault. And then in verse, I know the way our brain works. In verse 11, when she had brought him something to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, come lie with me. Now he calls her my sister. That should have been, And she was like, now here, God lets us know. She said no, right? He lets us know that she said no. Don't do it. No such thing should be done in Israel. This is disgraceful. And where could I take my shame? You're going to shame me. And then she tries to buy some time and kind of ploy her way out of it by saying what she says in 13. As for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel. Therefore, please speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you. Oh, yeah, he would. That it's forbidden, or he should. And then, but he wouldn't listen to her in verse 14. And then it says he forced her. And then in 15, he hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love or lust with which he had loved her. And he said, arise, and he's basically saying, get out of here. And she goes, no, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other thing you did to me. But he wouldn't listen to her. Then he calls his servants and he said, put this woman out. That's pretty bad. And now she had on a robe of many colors. That was what the king's daughters wore that were virgins, and she tears them. And his servant puts her out, and that last part just gets me, bolted the door behind her. So, I mean, the dude made his desire very clear to her. She wisely asked him to consider the result of what he's thinking to do. And he's not going to listen. And sometimes God is doing so many things, speaking so many warnings in so many different ways. He's trying to tell Amnon through her wisdom, this is not going to turn out well, and it's against everything that God says. But they won't listen. God knows how it's going to hurt them. God knows how it would hurt us when we don't listen. But we don't listen. So here the child is modeling his father too, David, right? I mean, he was a young boy when David was with Bathsheba. And since Amnon only had lust for Tamar when he felt guilty, when all this guilt starts taking over.
What verse are you on?
I'm just summarizing. Yeah, when all this guilt takes over, he hates her.
Not the woman.
I'm in 11 through 18, just summarizing 11 through 18. But he hates her because she's reminding him of what he did, right? Now he's looking at her and all he sees is what he did.
What he did, yeah.
And so he hates her and he says, "Get her out of here. I don't want my sin in my face. I don't want to see it," right?
Yeah.
How often has that happened in today's society? Oh my goodness. Girls, oh, he's so cute and everything. And then they want to be with him so bad. And you go to bed with them. And the next thing they're like, ugh, get away from me. I don't know you. I don't want you around. It happens every day, all the time. Right? And unfortunately, but they do. Now, he sort of could have helped the situation if he would have prayed and repented, or he could have paid the bride price. But she's no longer a virgin, and that is not good. Her value, unfortunately, has diminished. Not in God's eyes, for sure. It was, not her fault, but in general, in the public's eyes, her value has diminished. And as far as being able to be a bride, somebody's wife, her value has diminished now. And
Do we ever know what happened to her? I don't recall.
no, but when we get down there, I just have some thoughts about it, and we're really not told. But Amnon spitefully just shuts her out. I mean, she would have been highly sought after as a princess. She's a princess. She's David's daughter. She's a princess of Israel. She would have been highly sought after to get married. And now,
And she's so lovely, it says.
Yeah.
She's so lovely.
yeah, and now not so much. So verse 19 and 20, she puts ashes on her head, tears her robe. Right, this is going to kind of let her brother know, or anybody that sees it know something really bad happened, right? You don't do that that's a, And so Absalom in 20, her brother said to her, as Amnon, he just had a sense for some reason, or because he saw her go in there, I don't know. But he says, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this thing to heart." And so Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. So Tamar puts, she does all this stuff to let people know there was a terrible thing that was done to her. But
Absalom thought it was just dandy.
well, Absalom doesn't really like Amnon.
Yeah.
In the first place, they're half brothers. He really does not have a good place for Amnon in the first place. And he knew that he had to be involved, and so he's angry, but he doesn't do anything. Maybe because David doesn't do it. He takes it to David. David's the one that should have done something, but David doesn't do anything, and that's probably because of his past, right? Oh my goodness, David's past all of a sudden is like right in his face. And so, oh, you did it, Dad. How are you going to punish me? And so he doesn't do anything.
Except for 2 years, is that
Yeah.
in 23?
I
Yeah,
think Absalom knew what he was wanting to do, but poor old Tamar has nobody empathizing or sympathizing or helping
Yeah.
comfort her.
and David was 39 when he was with Bathsheba. He's about 50 now, so it's been a while. And Absalom
Comforted her.
Absalom is really upset, but Absalom's gonna play it cool.
To me, it was kind of like he was saying, well, don't be so upset since he's your brother anyway. Don't worry about it. He just, because she was very upset. And I think
Yeah,
Absalom
she was
was
raped.
just, comforting her,
Yeah,
consoling her.
Yeah.
In the back of his mind, he knew he was gonna get him.
yeah. I think, yeah, we find out as we read on that Absalom really loved his sister and it really affected him. And I think, yeah, it's just kind of like, you know, how especially with the Hispanics and stuff, it's like, you know, you just hang out, don't worry about it. And then him and the boys take care of it,
Have
right?
the Goel come and get them.
Yeah, you don't mess with our sister, and that's kind of where Absalom is, but because David didn't do anything, which was the righteous and right thing to do, they've got to bide their time, they got to figure it out. And so in verse 23 through 27, it came to pass after 2 full years, Absalom makes this plan, right? He'd been plotting revenge for 2 years. And now there's this big feast for this sheep shearing thing, and he's going to invite Amnon and his brothers to this big fiesta, big feast. And that's if David allows it. He's got to ask David. Again, it's going to put part of the blame on David because David's going to allow these guys to go to the sheep shearing, right? And I mean, David still got his eyes closed to what he should have been doing, obviously, because he even questions Absalom. You know, he says in verse 26 that the king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" Because he's asking for Amnon, right? And he even says, "Why should he go with you?" So he's even questioning it, and yet he lets him go. Not very good parenting. And then in 28, Absalom commanded his servants to watch when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. And when I say to you, strike Amnon, kill him. Don't be afraid. Have I not commanded you? Because they are under Absalom. He's got his own guys. Be courageous, be valiant. So they do. When he says to do it, they do it. And then all the rest of the kids get on their mules and they beat feet, right? So
It says mule and fled, is that not?
I know,
That's
you don't think of,
funny.
yeah, I think mules are fast, donkeys are slow.
Okay.
Is that the way-
I just, I'm
How
sorry.
come they didn't have horses? I mean,
They weren't allowed.
Oh, they weren't?
No, not really. Remember, God didn't want Israel to have a whole bunch of horses.
Oh, because of the chariots.
But Amnon's drinking. Amnon starts relaxing around David. I mean, I'm sure when he first was invited, he's probably a little freaked out because of what happened. But he's drinking. He's getting drunk. And then God promised David that the sword shall never depart from his house. So here is a partial fulfillment. And then in verse 30 through 36, while it came to pass, you know, David gets the news that Absalom has killed all the king's sons. little bit different, right? And not one of them is left. And so the king tears his garments and he's all messed up. And then Jonadab, David's brother, answered and said, no, that is not what happened. Only Amnon is dead. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. Therefore, let not my lord the king take this thing to his heart to think that all your kids are dead. It's only Amnon that's dead. So David, thinking all of his sons are dead, he doesn't seem not to believe that they're dead. He just tears the robes. I mean, he doesn't even question it, right? Because God said, the sword's never going to depart from your house. And so he's thinking, oh, okay, that happened. Now all my kids are dead. God's judgment on tearing my clothes. So he doesn't even question it. I mean, he's mourning until Jonadab tells him it's only Amnon. And then because he raped Tamar, he gives him the reason why even. And I mean, he's definitely grieving the death. This guy was what we would call the crown prince. You know, Amnon, crown prince, is dead. But it's your lack of discipline, David, that contributed to his murder. I mean, if David had done what he should have done, Absalom wouldn't have felt the need to carry out anything. You know, David should have administered correction. And then in the last couple of verses, Absalom fled and he goes to Talmai. king of Geshur. And then David's home mourning. Verse 38, Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there for 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. That word longed, in verse 39, I don't know if all your translations say longed. I had to look it up, but it means end. To long in this instance meant end or consume, be done away with, fulfill, destroy. The word is kala. And so really Absalom he's with his grandfather. That Talmai guy is really his grandfather on his mom's side in this town of Geshur. He can't come back unless King David gets the okay. He's banished. He's done something. He can't come back unless David goes, okay, you can come back. So he's there for 3 years. And David, without correcting Absalom for his evil, he just is kind of longing to be with him. Some commentators read it as Absalom was longing really to have Absalom punished for Amnon's, for what he did to Amnon. That he's longing for it to be over, longing for it to be put away, longing for it to end, because the word long in that place right there, that's kind of the meaning of it. So either way, he's either longing for him because he misses him, or he's longing for him because he wants this to end and it would punish him. But Joab, in verse 14, the son of Zeruiah, perceived that the king's heart was concerned about Absalom, and he sends to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman, and said to her, pretend to be a mourner, put mourning clothes on, don't put on oil, act like a woman who has been mourning a long time for the dead, and go to King David, talk to him, and then he's going to tell her what to say. So Joab, remember, is David's chief general. He can see David is just distracted from everything kingly by what's going on, and so he figures he's going to fix it. He's going to do something about it. And his idea is to soften David's heart towards Absalom, and he's going to do that by bringing in this widow and have her pretend to be a mourner, and she's going to come up with this story that Joab puts in her heart to tell. And the story is that she tells, as you read it, is a similar story. I know I had 2 boys, one killed the other one, and now everybody's coming to me and they want my other son to be dead, but then that's going to leave me with no legacy, nobody to carry on my husband's name. And she just she does this story that Joab told her to do. She really does it really well. And so David decrees that whoever says anything against this woman, any of her enemies, are going to be dealt with by him, and that her son won't die. David is ignoring justice at this moment by what he says, and he's guaranteeing her safety. He's guaranteeing safety of the one who killed the other. That is not what he's supposed to do. Remember the Avenger of Blood, the Goel, right? When one is killed, the Avenger goes after him, right? And if it's accidental, they hide in the city of refuge. That's how it goes. He's making a justice here that is ignoring all of that. But this is what Joab wants to hear, because whatever he says in this case, Joab can use it in the case of Absalom. And so he's happy with this ruling. And then in verse 12, turn my page here, all the way through verse 17, the woman is talking to David. She confronts him about not initiating reconciliation with Absalom. Absalom, we find out in here, is growing bitter, and he's also becoming a threat to Israel, right? If Absalom is bitter enough, he's going to gather together somebody and something, and he's going to come and march against Israel, is what she's trying to present. And it's not good. It's like in verse 13, why have you schemed such a thing against the people of God? That's what she's bringing forth, that, he's going to come after us. And so she tells David to find a way to do what has to be done to reconcile. And I mean, we have a way through Jesus. He deals with our sin. They needed to use the law, and the law was very specific about avenger of blood. God is also very specific about take a life, your life will be taken. He's very capital punishment. But Joab knew Absalom was the favorite with the people, and if David dies while Absalom is vanquished, if he's still out there and David dies, it's going to cause a civil war because the people like Absalom. And Absalom is now the next in line for the throne because Amnon's dead. And so he's also, Joab's pretty sure that David's going to reconcile with Absalom anyway at some point because he's in line for the throne. And so he wants to Joab's not stupid. Joab's a little conniving. Joab wants to be friends with Absalom and friends with David, because if David dies and Absalom takes over the throne, Joab can say, hey, I'm your buddy, I'm cool, I'm here. He's a smart dude. And then verse 18, then the king answered and said to the woman, don't hide from me anything that I ask you. And she said, please let my lord the king speak. Now she's telling the king he can speak. I think that's interesting. So the king said, is the hand of Joab with you in all this? And the woman answered and said in verse 19, as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right hand or to the left anything that my lord the king has spoken. For your servant Joab commanded me. He put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant to bring about this change of affairs. Your servant Joab has done this thing. But David, my lord, is wise according to the wisdom of the angel of God. Boy, she better read him out. To know everything that is in the earth. David somehow knew this was Joab, and she's saying, yep, sure was, kingy. And then 21, the king said to Joab, all right, I've granted this thing, bring back the young man Absalom. And Joab falls to the ground on his face and says, thanks, Dave. And today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my lord, O king, and that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant. And so Joab goes to Geshur and brings Absalom back to Jerusalem. And the king said, let him return to his own house, but don't let him see my face. So Absalom returned to his own house, but he doesn't seek his face. So,
What was that?
well, Joab got what he wanted, what he thought was best for Israel. But David here is going from Mr. Softy to really harsh with Absalom, saying, come back and I don't want you to see my face. He's sort of bipolar in the way he's dealing with his kids. First he didn't administer any justice. Now he's just going way far to the other side. That shouldn't have been. The kid was gone for 3 years. 3 years he was in banishment. They should have talked, If he's going to let him back, they should have talked. But refusing to see Absalom after being gone that long was not good. But 25 tells us, it's interesting, that it tells us how handsome Absalom was. And that he cut, and it would be 5.5 pounds of hair off each year. I don't even have 5.5 pounds of hair on my head.
I don't have
Yeah. But he cuts 5.5 pounds off every year. That's a lot of hair. And some of the pictures you see of Absalom, he had almost like the circular dreadlocks sort of thing going on. The Jewish sort of dreads, and then the dark complexion of Bathsheba that he had this, but yeah, he's very proud of his long hair.
Very proud of being
and-
handsome.
And very handsome, yeah. And then we find out he also names his daughter after his sister
Yeah.
Tamar. Now, see, this is where I think maybe Tamar, she died or something, because usually you don't name someone after someone so much back in those days unless they were gone, you know? But, I mean, we do now, we have, Justin Jr., Justin the third, but not so much, not so much then. So I think it just seems to me that something really, or she's just
Probably
never
committed
come out
suicide.
again.
She was so depressed.
Yeah, or she never come out again. Some commentators believe she did, the Bible doesn't really tell us, but it's just interesting. And then in verse 28, Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see David's face. So he's there 2 years, doesn't see his father. So he calls for Joab and he asks Joab to seek an audience for him with his dad, with David. But Joab doesn't even come. After Joab goes through all that to get Absalom there, and now Absalom says, hey, I need to talk to you, and he doesn't show up. Not making, good choices, right? But he gets his attention by setting his field on fire. It's like, if you won't come and talk to me, I'm going to get your attention. I'm going to set your field on fire. And sure enough, Joab shows up and like, what in the world are you doing? And he finally asks him to go speak to David. He wants to know why his dad has brought him here. It's like, and we see that, what's up, Dad? Why did you even call me? Why am I here? You call me on the phone, but you won't talk. What's up? And Absalom, it's interesting that Absalom kind of feels like he's justified in everything that he did. In verse 32, he said, come here so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? This is Absalom. It would be better for me to still be there. Therefore, let me see the king's face. But if there is iniquity in me, let him execute me. So Joab goes to the king and he tells them that, and he calls for Absalom, and he came to David. He bows himself on the face to the ground before the king, and then the king kissed Absalom. Well, that's a good, So Absalom is submitting to David, but this is all outward appearances, from if you've read the rest. This is an outward appearance. Oh, Dad, Dad. He had to bow in front of the king anyway. And the king kissed him, and David offers Absalom forgiveness, but without any repentance and without any resolution for killing his brother. It wasn't his duty. It wasn't his job. Unfortunately, David didn't do it, but that didn't give the right, revengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And we see that David starts following that, and had followed it, does follow it. His kid's not following it. He shouldn't have done it, but he doesn't do anything to him. I mean, and not just as a dad, but as king of Israel, it becomes more than personal. He should have done something. He shouldn't have overlooked his son's crimes as king of Israel. And I made a note, God will not wink at our sin. He forgives, but allows discipline and consequences, and he won't wink at David's sin either. And then in 15, after it happened that Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him, get up early, stand at the gate, and when anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, Absalom would call him and say, hey, where are you from? And he's like, oh, I'm from Hickory. And he'd go, well, look, your case is really a good case. You're probably going to win your case, but my dad, he doesn't have anybody to pay any attention to your case and everything, and you could be going through the courts for weeks. So if I was in charge, I'd have you right now, I'd listen to it, and you'd probably win. This is how, and he'd lift them up and he'd hug them, I mean, he's getting the people's
He's
all,
playing politics.
Yeah.
definitely playing politics.
Sounds so
He's trying to look royal. He comes in with this, tells us with this large procession of horses and chariots and stuff, trying to look all that.
My
And
internet's not good today. Every once in a while, I
very,
lose her.
very, yeah. Absalom's
gone
being
right now.
very political, very, very political. I put to the side note, he's kissing the babies.
Yeah.
You know how all the politicians would kiss the babies? That's what he's doing. So he's becoming more popular and more trusted than his dad, than David. Smart little moves. And then in verse 7, it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said to the king, please let me go to Hebron and pay the vow which I made to the Lord.
It says 40 years, and you said that a while back that David was 50, so 40 years, now he's 90.
No, this is is probably a typo from whoever was, it should be 4 years,
Oh.
okay?
Oh.
So most
Really?
everybody I've read, yeah, most every commentator, most everybody I read said that because of the way everything, it was probably as the scribe was writing it, that it makes sense that it would be 4 years. It could be 40, but it's hard to kind of squeeze everything else into that because David's about 57 at this time, and Absalom is about 25. And so most feel it's 4 years, which would make David, pardon me, make David 61 right now. Yeah,
I
61.
didn't catch that. In the Living Bible, it says 4 years.
Yeah, some
Yeah, it says 4 years, and in King James it says 40. So,
Yeah, some translations will go ahead and put it at 4. But Absalom is gonna ask to go to Hebron. So he's got this ruse supposedly to worship, but he's gonna be planning his mutiny for these 4 years. But David sends him in peace, and his last words to Absalom, who's gonna go and try to overthrow his daddy's kingdom, starting at Hebron, hoping most of Israel will see that he's succeeding the throne, not treason, not like he's taking the throne from his father, but that he's coming to succeed the throne. And and Absalom is hoping that will be the scenario that'll be played out, is succession, not treason. That's hard to say, treason.
Not much of a daddy-son relationship, is
No.
there, with any of them?
No, and that was a big problem. That was one of David's problems, he was not a good
He
parent.
was a warrior.
He was a warrior.
Yeah.
And remember, because he lived in the castle was huge, and they didn't live, it's not like living in a house like this
Yeah.
where you're in the house. They're in like
Separate houses.
bigger than the Biltmore, and they're all in separate places outside, and yeah, so, but not good parenting, no. But then in verses 11 and 12, he's gonna take 200 men with him. It's interesting, the Bible lets us know that the men aren't against David, but Absalom's trying to make this impression to the people that because they're riding with him, that they're against David, even though they're not. They're just riding with Absalom. He's also a prince, so he can command people to go. So then one of David's top aides, this guy defects and goes with Absalom, Ahithophel. Easy for you to say, Ahithophel. He's actually a traitor from David. He's going to be a defector, and but also, it really hurts David because he was his main dude there, his main counselor, and we find out that he's really a good counselor. He gives really good advice. This is when he wrote Psalms 41. You can put that on the side. Psalms 41 was when Ahithophel defected, but he was also the grandfather of Bathsheba, Ahithophel. And my personal thought is that Ahithophel didn't really get all that had happened with Uriah and Bathsheba and what David, and the child, when the child died and everything that went on, until they had been married a while. And, you know, at some point that Bathsheba might have said, well, Grandpa, you know, we were, you know, and this and that. And he might have at a little bit later place found out really everything that happened with David. And he does now not like David enough that he, being his best counselor, he defects and goes to Absalom. There had to be a reason that he hung out with David all that time and didn't do anything until now. I don't know. I'm just thinking he found out details that he didn't know before. So now Absalom is even giving kind of a spiritual out, you know, people look at him and think, because he's got this this spiritual appearance, because he's got this Ahithophel as his counselor, and Ahithophel is very wise. They said of Ahithophel, when he speaks, it's like God is speaking. And so now Absalom, you know, and then in verse 13, a messenger comes to David and he says, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. So David said to all his servants who were with him in Jerusalem, arise, let us flee, or we shall not escape from Absalom. And we've got to do it fast, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring disaster. You know, there's David, interesting that you don't see him praying right there,
Yeah,
asking the
right.
Lord about anything. I mean, David didn't want, David didn't want Jerusalem to be a battleground. I mean, David, you know, they're in Jerusalem and he says, Absalom's coming. He's got all these men with him. And I get he doesn't want Jerusalem to be a battleground. He doesn't want blood in the city of David, which is what he calls it. So he flees. And, I mean, he's still king, and he ends up leaving 10 of his concubines in the city. It wasn't pleasing to God that he had concubines. No, but he did. And he left 10 of them there to watch over the house. And do we all know what concubines are? Got that? Okay. And David thinks they're going to be safe there. And then he's got these paid bodyguards that we talked about last week going with him. And he's got the Gittites. These were from the Philistine city of Gath. These were 600 men that had been with him for quite a while. They were very faithful to him, and they're with him now. And David is watching this procession leaving Jerusalem, and he's actually afraid. He's feeling fear, and he writes Psalms 55 right about now.
Where's that?
Huh?
Which verse would that be correlating to?
When in 13 through 18. In this time period right here between 13 and 18, he writes Psalms 55, and you can see in that Psalms that he's in fear, but he trusts God, because he also writes Psalms 3 and Psalms 41. All three of those are in this time frame between verse 13 and 18.
But you said 58 was that last one, right? Psalms 58.
I
Okay,
thought you said 55.
Oh, 55.
55, 3, and 40.
Oh,
After 41.
I'm sorry.
it's
Psalms
Psalms
55.
55.
Yeah,
And the other two?
and 3 and 41.
41, okay. Thank you.
Are some of the ones you can see David's heart when all this is happening. And it says in verse 19, the king said to Ittai, I'm going to say, you know, this Gittite, this one that had been faithful to him and his 600 men, why are you going with us? Return and remain with the king. Speaking of Absalom, for you are a foreigner and also an exile from your own place. In fact, you came only yesterday. Should I make you wander up and down with us today? David's got a good heart. Since I go, I know not where. That's a familiar statement. Jesus said, I don't have a place to live. I know not where. Go back. But this guy answers the king and said, as the Lord lives, surely in whatever place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also your servant will be. And so David says to him, go and cross over. And so this guy and the Hittites and all his men, the 600 men and all their little ones, crossed over. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. They are now crossing over out of the promised land. That's why they are sad. They're crossing over, yeah. They're getting towards it. They're gonna completely cross over at the Jordan. They're gonna completely be out of the promised land when they
I
cross
like
over
that he
the.
said, and the little ones.
And the little ones. Yeah, everybody's out of the city because David is gonna leave it up to the Lord. Right? I mean, he flees only after hearing about Absalom, but he's gonna leave it up to the Lord. He couldn't understand why this Gittite who had just come would take the risk of being loyal to David. And we saw that he even called Absalom the king, totally leaving his fate with the Lord. But in the Ittai or whatever his name is calls David king. And it's like saying, no, your son's not king, you're still king, and no matter what it costs me, I'm going to follow you. That's what we say to Jesus Christ. You're king, whatever it costs me, I'm going to follow you. And faithful. And I love that. David had been in the wilderness before he became king. If you remember, he was the Philistines and all that stuff was going on. God had him out in the wilderness and everything. He was training him, teaching him, and molding him how to be king. Now he's going to send him out in the wilderness again because he has some work to do in his life. And then in 24 through 26, we got Zadok and the priests, the Levites, right? They've got the ark. And Abiathar, the priest, went up until all the people had finished crossing over from the city. And the king King David says to Zadok, carry the ark back to the city. And if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both the ark and his dwelling place. But if he says thus, I have no delight in you, speaking of God, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him. Man, that's just, I don't know, I find that beautiful. David is right now, he's in that moment, he's in that place where he should be with the Lord. He's putting it all back to the Lord. But the Zadok and the priests were loyal to David, even though Absalom could kill them if he becomes king. They're loyal to David, but not the ark. He's willing to let the ark go back to Jerusalem, and he's putting himself in God's hands. He knows God is going to be righteous, and so he's just submitting to him. He's trusting in God. He's not David, and this is him. David is trusting in God, not in the ark. Put the ark back in the temple where it belongs. The presence, he understands now the presence of God is with him all the time. It doesn't have to be where the ark is. We understand we don't have to go into church to worship God. God is with us everywhere we are. And, but he's trusting in God. And then we understand from verse 27 through 29, this Zadok the priest, he's a prophet and a priest, and he could be a valuable source of information for David. So he tells him to go back to the city. And then in verse 30, it says, so David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and he wept as he went up, and he had his head covered and went barefoot. This was the same steps of Jesus when he went to Gethsemane to pray. This ascent of the Mount of Olives. And so it's a picture of the Lord as David is weeping. He's just struck by the greatness of all this tragedy. As Jesus was going up to pray, remember he ended up praying drops of blood. Jesus was so struck by the greatness of what was going on and everything going on. And wow. And then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, oh Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Ahithophel, again, his wise counselor, good buddy, been with him for a long time. He was a traitor, and he went with Absalom. And now he's going to be counseling Absalom. And so David's prayer, and you underline David's prayer, "O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." That's his prayer, quick, to the point, right? And so now in 31 through all the way through 37, he's talking about what happens and how he's going to send these guys back. David's going to send some of his loyal guys, his loyal counselors, back to Jerusalem, and they're going to pretend to be loyal to Absalom, but they want to get on the inside of things. And their whole thing is to thwart the advice of Ahithophel. So Hushai, he wants Hushai to learn what Absalom's going to be up to here. And through all these loyal priests and friends of David, David can find out what's going on, what Absalom's got planned, what Absalom's got up his sleeve. So in the palace, hearing what's going on for Absalom, from Absalom for David, we've got Hushai, Zadok, we've got Abiathar and some of the priests, we've got Ahimaaz, I guess, and Jonathan. Yeah, and Jonathan. David's got these guys in there as his spies, right? And so in chapter 16, when David was a little past the top of the mountain, there was Ziba. Do you remember Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth? Remember Ziba? Remember David had said, "Is there anybody left from Saul's house that I can bless?" Or from John? And Ziba goes, "Hey, yeah, there's this Jonathan. He's lame in his foot. Mephibosheth. He's lame in his feet." And so he brings him to David, and David said, "I'm going to bless you, and then you're going to get all of Saul's land back." And he tells Ziba, you and your family are going to be his servants. He told Ziba, "You're going to have whatever you want, all the lands you want, and you'll be well taken care of. Your family will be taken care of, and Mephibosheth is going to eat at my table." That's this Ziba dude. And so Ziba shows up with supplies for David and his men. And he tells David a lie. This is so sad. Everything, all the way that David took care of Ziba and Ziba's family. And now Ziba's going to tell David that Mephibosheth is still in Jerusalem. Mephibosheth thinks that his reign is going to be restored. And so he's there waiting for David to be conquered, and he's going to take over as king. Because remember, Mephibosheth was Saul's grandson. He would have been in line for Saul's throne. But it's a lie. Ziba is telling him a lie. And David gives all of Mephibosheth's possessions to Ziba, thinking that Mephibosheth has turned against him. He gives everything that he had given to Mephibosheth to Ziba. Ziba's the one that's telling the lie. Man, dang. But he's thinking Ziba's truthful, and it's sad. And then in verse 5 through 8, we have this Shimei. Shimei, he was a relative of Saul, and he doesn't like David being king. And he contributed David having to leave the city to God's punishment. Wrong. God was dealing with David, but not because of Saul. So this Shimei is like, he's throwing rocks and everything, and he's being all nasty towards David because of what David did, and he's thinking, yeah, see, you had to leave the city. God's punishing you because of what you did to Saul. And that's just wrong. I mean, God is dealing with David, but not because of Saul. But he's so cool. David is so cool with this guy. David's nephew, this Abishai, in verse 9, he wants to kill this Shimei because Shimei's throwing rocks at David and his men, and he's saying, I mean, he's king, right? He's king. And this Abishai, he wants to kill him. And David stops him because David's willing to hear what he thinks God might have to say through this cursing, this critic of his. And I mean, it says that David knows that God can shut Shimei's mouth if he wants to, and he's not, and so he's going to listen to him. It's like, if we can revenge ourselves, even if you can, David could, even though David could revenge himself, God is saying, don't do it. Leave it to me. And David gets that. That's another thing, David, being a man after God's own heart, even though you can take revenge, you don't. You still leave it to the Lord. That's what David's doing. And he's following David, and as he refuses to cling to the throne, David, speaking of David, he's just going to submit to God's will. And that's when I saw Jesus, who took the form of a bondservant, humbled himself, and became obedient to the point of death. So is David, a man after God's own heart, who believes the throne belongs to the Lord, not to David. So he is able to walk away from the throne, leave it in God's hands, because David doesn't see the throne as his throne. He sees it as God's throne. He doesn't take revenge for this guy yelling and throwing rocks, even though he could. He's instead listening for what God might say to him. And so in verse 15, we've got Hushai, David's friend. He's going to pledge allegiance to Absalom, but that's only because he's going to work as a spy for David. And he's going to give Absalom bad advice. And so in verse 20, Absalom says to Ahithophel, give advice as to what we should do. And Ahithophel says to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, not a good thing. And all Israel will hear that you are abhorred by your father. And then the hands of all who are with you will be strong. So they pitch a tent in verse 22 for Absalom on the top of the house, and he goes into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Ahithophel tells Absalom to go into David's concubines who had been left in Jerusalem in safety, not only an act of immorality, but an act of treason against David, who is still king. And Ahithophel's revenge against David. I mean, Ahithophel, again, Bathsheba's grandpa, had to have heard details down the road to want to incite this much revenge against David. It didn't, otherwise, to me, and I'm not saying that's what it is, but to me, it doesn't make any sense. Why, that you would be his best buddy and his counselor all this time, and then now you want to kill the guy, But you see what his revenge is. You go into David's, this is Ahithophel telling Absalom, you go into David's concubines, just like David did to my granddaughter Bathsheba, right? So he's kind of doing the, but it's going to hurt a lot of people, and it's going to cause Absalom to sin a great sin, but it also fulfills God's promise. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, God, if you look back at 42, verse 42, or 11 and 12, excuse me, Samuel 12, verse 11 and 12, he told him, you did it in secret, but I'm going to, this is going to happen out in the open. And he said, this is what's going to happen. Somebody's going to come and take your wives. And God said it was going to happen, so it did. So Ahithophel had a well-deserved reputation for giving good counsel like it was from God, but not today. This is bad stuff. And then chapter 17, Ahithophel said to Absalom, let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. Now, this is bad advice. I mean, this is good advice, but from a bad guy. Okay, I'm going to pursue David tonight. I'm going to come upon him while he's weary, weak, make him afraid. All the people who are with him are going to run away. I'm only going to kill the king. I'm going to bring back all the people to you. And when all return except David, whom you seek, all the people will be at peace. The saying pleased Absalom. and all the elders of Israel. So he's giving this advice to do it quick, selective attack on David. He's weak, he's tired. He wants to do it before they cross over the Jordan River. Once they cross over the Jordan River, they are completely out of Israel. And he tells Absalom, look, I'm only going to strike the king, David. He knows David is king because he says, I'm only going to strike the king, David. He doesn't call Absalom king. That's a little slip of the old tongaroo there. And Absalom likes the plan to kill his father, but in verses 5 through 10, Absalom said, now call Hushai, which is David's buddy, put there to be a spy, call him and let us hear what he says too. I mean, this is God, that Absalom would ask Hushai's advice. This is God intervening and putting Hushai's into Absalom's ears. So Hushai comes to Absalom and he said, this is what Ahithophel told me to do. What do you say? And quick thinking, he just heard the plan. Now he's got to come up with a different plan, right? That will benefit David. And so he says, Ahithophel's advice isn't any good. And so in verse 8, he says, you know, your father and his men, they are mighty men. They are enraged in their minds like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Your father is a man of war and will not camp with the people. Surely by now he is hidden in some pit or in another place. And it will be when some of them are overthrown at the very first that whoever hears it will say, there's a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom. And even he who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt completely. All Israel knows that your father's a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. Verse 11, therefore I advise all Israel, be fully gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba like the sand that is by the sea for multitudes, and that you go to battle in person, you, Absalom, so that we will come upon him in some place where he may be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him, there shall not be one left. Moreover, verse 13, if he has withdrawn into a city, all Israel shall bring ropes to that city. We're going to pull it to the river until there's not one stone left. So Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai is better than the advice of Ahithophel. And underline the next verse, for the Lord had purposed to defeat the good advice of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring disaster on Absalom. This is answering the prayer. Remember when David prayed that one sentence back there and I said underline it? Read that sentence and then see what God's doing here. And this is really smart because Absalom heard the advice of Ahithophel and he said, that's cool. But Absalom saw the advice of Hushai. Hushai, and this is true in anything, and it's so smart. Hushai painted a picture. These mighty men are out there, and he's bringing Absalom back to the younger days when David was this guy, right? This warrior. And they're like men that are, their cubs, you know, are gone like bears, and this, and he's over here probably hiding. You can't find him, and he's painting this huge picture, and Absalom is just falling into this picture. And he tells Absalom, you come, you're the mighty warrior. All of Israel is following you into battle and you're going to be the win. Ahithophel says, I'll kill the king. Yeah, right? But Ahithophel, if they follow Ahithophel's advice, they will get David and they will be able to get him and kill him. It's really good advice. But God puts it in Hushai's mind to paint this picture, and Absalom goes with Hushai. Only God could do that. And then in the meantime, verses 15 through 20, so Hushai, remember the guys that David has there all around him, he tells Zadok and Abiathar the priest, what Ahithophel said, and now he's telling him what he said, and it's going to buy David some time. So all these guys they're going out to give the message to David. They can't get in the city, so they find a servant girl and they give her the message. She hides them for a minute in the well, so nobody finds them, and they get the message over to David that of what's going on. And it's smart too when he says you should gather all of Israel, because to gather all the troops of Israel is going to take Absalom a minute in time here, you know, whereas the other guy just wanted to run out and do it right away. So he's biding David some time. And this is all just amazing. So Hushai tells Zadok what the plan is from Ahithophel, and Zadok gets the message to David through Jonathan and Ahimaaz and the servant girl. Ahithophel knew with Hushai's plan that Absalom would fail. Ahithophel knows if Absalom follows Hushai's plan, but it's the Lord's plan, that it will fail, David will win, Absalom will lose the throne, and Ahithophel, as the traitor to Absalom, is going to be in bad shape, right? David will probably have him killed. So what does he do? He puts his house in order, shows you he's not distressed, he's not distraught. He's putting his house, there's a big fly in here. Is that a bee?
A bee?
No, where did, all right, Dolores now she brought a bee in.
I've been wanting bees at my house to pollinate flowers.
But, anyway, he, yeah, I'll have to get the beekeeper down here, Doug. Oh, I know. So, but anyway, he tells him the plan, and he gets his house in order, but he commits suicide.
Why did he do that?
Because he knows that this plan that Hushai has
Yeah.
will fail. He's a smart guy. He's a wise guy. He knows the plan's going to fail, that Absalom will not take the throne. David will take the throne back. He can see all this, and he knows David will have him killed because he was a traitor. And so he does it his own self, and he does it very organized. He puts his house in order, gets it all, you know, and but he destroys he set his house in order, but he destroys his soul. Revenge, lies, and pride destroyed that man. Absalom is after David. In verse 24, 24, 25, and 26, David went into Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed over the Jordan. Now they're all out of Israel. So Absalom's after David, and he makes this guy Amasa captain of his army. They both cross over the Jordan. They're out of the land of Israel. But Amasa was another one of David's nephews. And his sister was Abigail. It's not the same Abigail that David married. Don't get confused with that. It's his sister is named Abigail. And in verse 27, it happened when David had come to Mahanaim that Shobai, the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the people of Ammon, Mechir, the son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai, the Gilead from Rogelim. They bring beds and basins and earthen vessels and wheat and barley and flour and beans and lentils and seeds and honey and curd, sheep and cheese. I mean, we've got all these people at the end of the day coming to fulfill this great need. I mean, David and his men are just, they're at the point of death. And here comes these guys to feed the people and refresh and encourage. They're from the Lord. Shobai, son of Nahash, king of Ammon. He was east of the Jordan, and he was a descendant of Lot. And then we have Machir, a member of Saul's house who kept Mephibosheth. Machir was
I'm ready.
Go away.
Am I the only one that these names
No.
are very upsetting because I can't keep track of them because the word means nothing.
Don't hit it.
Well, Shobai,
Hear of these things.
I know.
Shobai is a descendant from Lot, so he's an Israelite. And Machir is a member of Saul's house. He's the one that Mephibosheth was staying in. And Barzillai, this guy Barzillai was a wealthy believer. And he supported David, and he was from the tribe of Manasseh. So what it's telling us, they were all faithful Israelites that helped David. We have a bee in the house. If you're wondering what we're doing when you look on YouTube, what in the world? What in the world is she doing? Yeah.
Did you get it?
No, there he
Should
is.
be.
There's,
There's
there's
two
two
of
of
them.
them.
Oh.
What in the
Oh,
world?
we don't have
I don't know
a
what's
hive.
going
She
on.
must have a nest over there.
Yeah.
in
Oh
that
my
window.
God.
Hey, Dad,
Or up there, and it looks like a crawl space right
I was
there
gonna get
above.
Doug, huh? No, I've never had a bee
They keep
here.
going over to the window. Of course,
Yeah, I've
they
never
will
had a
probably
bee.
want
There
out.
there's somewhere that might be they're
Wasp.
coming in.
They're wasp,
I think it's a wasp.
Trish.
Yeah, I've never had, I
didn't do it, I promise.
Whatever it is, it stings.
I don't
Yeah.
care if it my house.